The Sonoma sun was blinding, but I felt only absolute cold. I stood at the edge of the vineyard, watching Tyler smile at the altar with Brianna. He looked invincible. Then Frank, his lead investor, took the microphone. It took Frank exactly 2 minutes to systematically dismantle Tyler's professional reputation in front of his elite clients. Tyler's mask of arrogance shattered right there on the grass. A full year earlier, the war began not with a scream, but with a simple click of a mouse. It was 11:51 at night. Tyler was asleep in the master bedroom, dreaming of his upcoming tech startup launch. I was at my desk in the glow of my monitor, looking at the shared cloud drive. There they were. My architectural blueprints, the municipal designs I had spent 2 years perfecting, completely rebranded and filed under his company's proprietary assets folder. He was stealing my intellectual property to secure his seed funding. I didn't cry. I didn't storm into the bedroom and demand an explanation. Anger wasn't loud this time. It was clinical. This wasn't a betrayal of love. It was a breach of contract. I rubbed my eyes, trying to summon regret, but there was only clarity. This wasn't a breakdown. It was a balance sheet. By 12:03 in the morning, my extraction was underway. I packed exactly what was legally mine: 2 suitcases of clothes, my personal laptop, and my original hard drives. I left the expensive jewelry he had bought to silence my previous complaints. I left the designer furniture. I performed a surgical removal of my existence from his life. I refused to give him the satisfaction of a reaction, the messy, emotional exit he would undoubtedly use to call me unstable. I was going to the Sonoma estate. During our initial separation discussions, Tyler had mockingly insisted I take the vineyard. He laughed when he signed it over, calling it a tax-draining dump that would bleed me dry. It was overgrown, abandoned, and entirely mine. The drive took 3 hours. The headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the overgrown vines as I pulled up to the main house. The paint was peeling and the porch sagged, but the foundation was solid. Tyler thought he had handed me an anchor to drown me. He didn't realize he had given me a fortress. I walked inside, set my bags down, and opened my laptop. There was no hesitation. I had been the silent investor in his version of reality for too long. Now, I was liquidating my assets. The transaction of our marriage was closed. I drafted an email to my lawyer, attached the timestamps of his file access, and hit send. The sun was just starting to rise over the hills, casting long shadows across the neglected grapes. I had absolutely nothing but the clothes in my bags and a dilapidated property, but my ledger was finally clean. I didn't feel fear. I felt the total control of an architect staring at a blank blueprint. The silence of the vineyard was heavy, but it was nothing compared to the silence of the past 7 years. I sat on the dusty floorboards of the main room, looking out at the acreage. For years, I had been the invisible architect of Tyler's success. I had drafted his office layouts, designed his presentation materials, and nodded quietly at dinner parties while he took the credit. He had systematically convinced me that my vision was too small, that I was merely a drafter while he was the visionary. I believed him because the manipulation was a slow, invisible drip. It was a prison without bars. The psychological toll of surviving that kind of marriage isn't a sudden explosion. It's a quiet erosion of your identity. You become so accustomed to the weight of their expectations that you mistake the chains for jewelry. I had learned to survive by making myself small, by anticipating his moods and adjusting my shape to fit his needs. It was an invisible chain of the survivor, keeping me tethered to a man who saw me as nothing more than a stepping stone. But I hadn't been entirely asleep. Even as he gaslit me, a quiet, analytical part of my brain had been keeping the books. I remembered the exact moment I realized I was just dead weight to him. We were at a gala, and a potential client asked about my firm. Tyler had stepped in, laughing, and said I mostly just picked out paint colors. I felt the invisible chain snap right then. I didn't argue. I just started paying the property taxes on this Sonoma estate from my own private account. I paid them for 3 years, ensuring the title remained clear, anticipating the day the market would crash on our relationship. Tyler never checked the ledgers. He was too arrogant to look at the details. He assumed my silence was submission, but it was strategy. I was just auditing the accounts, waiting for the right moment to foreclose on his ego. Sitting in the dust of my new headquarters, I felt the last remnants of the invisible chain dissolve. There was no sadness for the years I lost, only the cold, sharp focus of an auditor reviewing a fraudulent return. I opened my drafting software and began to work. I had a municipal contract to win, and I was going to build my empire on the very dirt he threw away. I mapped out the structural integrity of my new life, relying on logic rather than emotion. My boundaries were drawn in permanent ink. Over the next 3 months, the dilapidated estate transformed into a streamlined command center. I hired contractors to clear the vines and update the main house, turning the massive living room into an architectural studio. I worked 18-hour days, channeling every ounce of clinical focus into my proposals. It paid off. Last week, I secured the multi-million-dollar municipal contract for the city's new tech corridor. It was the exact project Tyler's investors had wanted to anchor their portfolio. I won it cleanly, legally, and brilliantly. Meanwhile, Tyler and Brianna's wedding was fast approaching. They had decided to host it at the vineyard. Tyler's email demanding access had been a masterpiece of entitlement. He assumed that because the divorce wasn't finalized, he could commandeer the property he deemed worthless for a rustic chic aesthetic. I didn't want to see him, but per the temporary court-mandated division of assets during our pending divorce, he was technically entitled to host events on the property until the final decree. I begrudgingly agreed in writing, but I treated the mandatory compliance as a strategic move. Let them come. When they arrived on Friday to set up, they drove their luxury SUV right past my new signage. They stepped out, expecting a ruin. Instead, they walked into the headquarters of a fully operational, highly lucrative architectural firm. Tyler's smug expression faltered as he took in the drafted blueprints on the glass tables, the municipal contract framed on the wall, and the bustling team of junior architects I had hired. Brianna looked around in confusion, holding her designer wedding planner binder. Tyler's eyes locked onto the municipal contract. He knew exactly what it was. It was the contract his startup desperately needed to survive the quarter. He realized in real time that the worthless dump he had mocked was now the epicenter of his biggest professional rival. He tried to puff out his chest, trying to assert dominance in a space he no longer controlled. He demanded to know how I managed this. I didn't raise my voice. I just looked at him with the detached interest of an executive reviewing a bad investment. I told him I simply leveraged the assets he undervalued. The wedding preparations continued around us, but the power dynamic had permanently shifted. He was a guest in my territory, renting space in the shadow of my success. The hostility escalated, but I didn't engage in his petty arguments. I was simply calculating the final margin. They weren't shocked by what they'd done. They were shocked that I'd stopped playing along. The professional warfare was satisfying, but the lethal blow came from a completely different ledger. It arrived on a Tuesday afternoon via a secure email from my attorney. He had been conducting a standard title sweep of the Sonoma property to finalize my business incorporation. What he found wasn't just an irregularity, it was a criminal twist that snapped the trap completely shut. Tyler hadn't just inherited a rundown vineyard from his uncle. He had inherited a Class 1 commercial water rights permit, an incredibly rare asset in California worth millions. Years ago, before his tech startup ever existed, Tyler had secretly used those water rights as collateral for a private high-interest loan to fund his initial tech development. He forged the secondary lien documents, betting that the private lender wouldn't conduct a full title search against my name. He thought he was brilliant. There was just one massive, undeniable problem. The water rights permit was inextricably tied to the land title. And because the deed to the Sonoma property had been transferred solely into my name months earlier, he had effectively leveraged an asset he didn't legally possess. He had unknowingly committed federal wire fraud and grand larceny. He had built his entire tech startup, his entire identity as a self-made genius, on stolen land claims and fraudulent capital. It wasn't just a mistake, it was a felony. I sat at my drafting table, reading the legal summary. My heart didn't race, my breathing didn't change. I simply verified the data. The documentation was bulletproof. Bank records, forged signatures, and municipal stamps all lined up in a neat, devastating column. I forwarded the entire dossier to Frank, Tyler's lead venture capitalist. Frank was an old-school investor, a man who valued compliance and legal integrity above all else. He despised fraud. I didn't include an emotional plea. I just attached the file with a single line. Due diligence report for your current portfolio. The accounting was complete. The deficit was fatal. Tyler thought he was playing chess, but he was just bankrupting himself on a board I owned. All that was left was the collection, and I intended to collect in full. The balance sheet was finally written in stone. The Saturday of the wedding arrived with pristine, mocking perfection. I stood at the edge of the vineyard, wearing a sharp, tailored suit, watching the spectacle unfold. Tyler and Brianna exchanged vows under a floral arch that probably cost more than his remaining liquid assets. He smiled for the cameras, exuding the hollow confidence of a man who believed his own lies. Then came the reception. The champagne flowed, the string quartet played, and Frank stepped up to the microphone for the keynote toast. The crowd hushed, expecting a glowing endorsement from the billionaire kingmaker. Frank looked directly at Tyler, his face devoid of warmth. He didn't raise a glass. Instead, he pulled a small, thick manila folder from his jacket and stepped calmly into Tyler's personal space. His voice didn't need to cut through the air. It was a quiet, lethal announcement that traveled to every nearby investor. He informed Tyler and everyone within earshot that he was pulling his firm's capital immediately, then dropped the due diligence dossier into Tyler's hands, so the evidence of his fraud was public property. Frank then turned his focus toward the investors seated in the front rows, methodically detailing the facts of the federal fraud. He spoke with cold, clipped precision, ensuring the relevant stakeholders fully grasped the gravity of the stolen water rights, the forged signatures, and the misappropriated intellectual property. He exposed that the very ground they were standing on, the venue Tyler claimed to own, was the legal property of his ex-wife. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the sound of an empire evaporating. The illusion of power of an empty wallet is a fascinating psychological collapse to witness. Men like Tyler construct their entire identity around their financial leverage. When you strip away the capital, there is no core personality left underneath. They are entirely hollow. Their arrogance isn't a personality trait, it's a rental item. As the truth set in, Tyler's mask completely disintegrated. The suave tech executive vanished, replaced by a panicked, fragile shell of a man. His investors were already walking toward the exit, making angry phone calls to their legal teams. Brianna stood frozen, her perfect wedding destroyed, staring at a man who was suddenly facing federal prison. Tyler scrambled off the dais and ran toward Frank, begging. He pleaded for a private meeting, for a grace period, for a loan to cover the fraud. Frank ignored him and walked away. Then Tyler saw me. He stumbled across the grass, his designer tuxedo rumpled, his face pale and sweating. He begged me to retract the documents, to sign over the title, to save him. He offered me shares in a company that was already dead. I watched him plead, completely unmoved. There was no pity. There was no triumph. There was only the clinical observation of a ledger balancing out to zero. This wasn't revenge, Tyler, I said, my voice quiet and cold. It was just accounting. I turned my back on him and walked toward my studio. Minutes later, a pair of nondescript black SUVs pulled into the vineyard driveway. Federal agents stepped out, serving the warrant with quiet, professional efficiency. Tyler was escorted away in silence, the lack of sirens and theatrics making his downfall feel all the more final. The catering staff packed up the untouched food, and the guests scattered like shadows. I was back in my office, the soft hum of my computer the only sound in the room. I sat at my desk and opened the municipal blueprints. The project was moving into phase 2, and there was real work to be done. Looking out the window at the empty lawn, I expected to feel a massive surge of triumph. But revenge is a strangely empty return on investment. It doesn't fill the deficit. It just clears the debt. I realized then that Tyler had never been the powerful villain I made him out to be in my head. He was just a man with a fragile, hollow ego, desperately stealing resources to prop up a facade he couldn't afford. He was a bad investment, and I had simply closed the account. The true victory wasn't his destruction. It was my reconstruction. I had built a thriving firm from the ground up, turning a discarded piece of land into a monument of my own capability. The quiet erosion of those invisible years had been replaced by the solid architecture of my own peace. I've come to realize that forgiveness isn't always for the other person. Sometimes it's the only way to set yourself free. Setting yourself free doesn't mean allowing them back into your life. It means evicting them from your mind. It means refusing to chase the approval of those who never had the capacity to give it. You cannot build a stable house on a foundation of someone else's dysfunction. You have to draw a hard line, pour your own concrete, and design a life that belongs entirely to you. I learned to be the silent investor in my own worth. If you've ever had to become the architect of your own peace, hit that subscribe button. Tell me your story in the comments. I'm reading them all.